Hello, welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Death. I'm Fran Solomon.
And I'm Andy McNeil.
And we're thrilled to be your host for these conversations. Let's Talk Death is brought to you by Heal Grief, a social support network creating community after someone has died. Everything we do is inspired by our core belief that no one should ever grieve alone.
Our goal with this program is to have a friendly chat with some amazing people so we can help normalize and educate our Heal Grief community. Our guest today is Bonnie Carroll. Bonnie is a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, a retired U.S. Air Force Reserve officer, the surviving spouse of Brigadier General Tom Carroll, a former staffer in the Reagan and Bush White Houses, and the president and founder of the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors, TAPS. Ms. Carroll founded TAPS following the death of her husband in an Army C-12 plane crash on November 12, 1992. Through her vision and leadership, TAPS is the leading national military service organization providing comfort, care, and resources to all those grieving the death of a military loved one. And, might I say, that I recently joined the TAPS team as their senior advisor to youth programs. So this is a very special treat for me, Bonnie, to welcome you to Let's Talk Death. We are so delighted to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Andy and Fran, and it's an honor to be here. I'm really looking forward to today's conversation.
Bonnie, welcome. The work you have done with TAPS has been so instrumental in providing military families comfort, care, and hope after the death of their military loved one. I wonder if you could share your personal journey and the founding of TAPS.
Well, thank you so much, Fran, for the opportunity to share. You know, I had a career before my husband and I met, and it actually involved working with survivors of trauma and working at a senior level in the government and understanding how the government worked in addition to then my reserve military service. So sort of those three things were there in the background. Fast forward now several years, and when my husband was tragically killed in that Army plane crash, my very first thought was, isn't it fortunate I've had this training, this experience, I'll be able to handle this, we'll get, I'll get through it, our family will get through it, I'll help everybody. And that, Fran, that little fantasy lasted about 30 seconds, and I just could not breathe. But knowing that there are supports available, I went looking, when I was able to catch my breath, to take a step forward for those groups that I knew existed for other types of loss in our society, and I felt confident had to exist for the military. And it was just unbelievable to me that it didn't exist for the military back then. So, I thought, well, grief is grief. And I went to the group that I knew for families of police officers who had died, a group called COPS, Concerns of Police Survivors. And sitting in those support groups, I found, wow, I don't speak this language. These aren't my people. This isn't my community. And I went to hospice groups, and I went to another group for victims of homicide loss, and nobody was really speaking my language. It wasn't until I got back in touch with the other widows who had lost their husbands along with mine that we suddenly found, oh, my people, you're speaking my language. We immediately had everything in common. I'd gone to several professional grief counselors, and I just wound up feeling, you don't get it. You don't know that my world has stopped. You don't know that, everything has changed now. It felt like such empty platitudes. But when I was sitting there with the other widows, it was from the heart. It was sincere, it was real, it was authentic. And we could cry, and we could laugh, and we could share memories and stories and fears. And really find a way to somehow put one foot in front of the other. So that's really the whole genesis of how TAPS came to be. It was creating that community for the military where it hadn't existed before.
Yeah, there are so many wonderful psychotherapists and individuals that we can go to and share our story. But the real, what I believe healing is when you can connect with someone else who really understands your journey, your trials, your tribulations, more than anyone you can pay to do so. And that's not discounting the great work that these professionals do, but it's a different support.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. There's a place. There's certainly a place for that, but it doesn't replace what I think of as peer connections. Mm-hmm. And how important that is. I am curious, Bonnie, as you've watched TAPS over the years, and so many of us just in the bereavement field have watched all the wonderful work and just the way the program has grown. What are some of the things that have surprised you as you've seen sort of TAPS grow, and what are some differences maybe that you see today that maybe didn't exist when you were going through your first going through your experience?
Well, of course, a huge shift has been the connections on social media. I mean, back in the early 90s, we had AOL dial-up. And so connections were much slower and communication was much slower. But now we're able to really instantly connect. We've got, Facebook groups. We've got people who are sharing their, deepest, darkest emotions very openly. So that's been a big shift. But for the organization and how we approach grief, I think we've really grown in that. And one of the big pivotal shifts was looking at its not being so much about the moment or the manner of death, which seems to be a big focus publicly with the military, whether it was a combat loss or a training accident or a suicide or an illness due to toxic exposures. But putting all of that aside and looking at it being about the life and the service, being equally important that the person lived and that they lived a life that included this selfless service to their country, and honoring that, recognizing that while the person may have physically died, they never stopped loving, and that love lives on. And we redefine our relationship. This is so important, Andy, what you've seen with the kids at the Good Grief Camp. That will always be their dad or their big brother or sister. That will always be someone very important in their life. And they can now redefine that relationship that they will always have with their loved one. So I think shifting that. One of the things we do at TAPS, we send cards on the anniversary of the death, but we also send cards celebrating the birthday, the day that person came into the world and their life started. So it's just a beautiful expression of love and hope.
Yeah.
And for me, to further on that, it's a way of keeping that person living on in the heart and the mind of those they've left behind, and carrying that with them. My daughter knows her grandfather, who she never met. So it's keeping them alive with us.
Absolutely. And they are very present and continue to inspire us. And we have a saying at TAPS that we are the living legacies of American service and sacrifice. We are all very familiar with the beautiful monuments and the perfect military headstones, but our families are that living legacy.
Yeah. I was conducting a training one time, and part of the training we were discussing the concept of continuing bonds and continuing that relationship and how important that is. And at the break, one of the a woman who was in the audience came up to me and she said, I just have to tell you, you were sharing that, and I don't know why I've never thought of it this way. She said, but I was maybe 6 or 7 when my sister died. And I have to tell you, I'm in my 60s, and I think she's been my companion throughout my life. Like she's still very present in the sense of I think about her and I find myself, kind of talking to her in my head and, things like that. And she said, I had never thought of it, that it was a continuing relationship. I just didn't consider it that way. So it is interesting how there has been a shift even in our society more toward that sense of remembering and honoring and continuing that relationship.
I love that, Andy. That's beautiful. That reminds me early on in my grief, a very wise woman who was patient enough to just listen to me, just so heartbroken and in so much deep grief. She let me go on for quite a while. And then she said, did your husband enrich your life? And it was this so, out of the blue. And I said, oh my gosh, in so many ways. And I just then went off in a whole different direction of, unconditional love and just his courage and his patriotism and his support and fun and laughter, all these wonderful things that he had given me, all these gifts. And she, again, very patiently, let me just very enthusiastically share all of this. And then she looked at me and she said, so what are you going to do with those riches? And that really was an epiphany. And that was a real launching point to create.
I'm going to use that. That's amazing. I'm going to use that.
Oh, it's
very
so
powerful.
What a question. Did your husband enrich your life? What a question. Wow.
Great.
Wow.
Andy and I were talking offline earlier, and he was, explaining, and me coming from a military family as well, you're part of the military while you're active and in service. And then when there's a death loss of your military member, it's kind of like, are you still part of the community? Are you not still part of the community? And TAPS is really a wonderful, wonderful way to stay connected as a military family to others. I mean, it's beyond connecting peer-to-peer, experiencing a death loss. It adds another layer of staying connected as a military family.
Oh, Fran, that's so important. And, I look at it kind of like an alumni association, that the person who physically connected us to that institution is now no longer present, but we have a very special connection to that institution. So at TAPS, we have the chairman of the Joint Chiefs speak at our survivor seminars. We hold events at military installations, but we do all of this now in our own identity as military survivors, as families of that loss, as the living legacies. And, a lot of times the military will say, well, we'll never forget you. You'll always be included. But we recognize that it's just so important to be included now in our own right. It's interesting for our kids, especially, they had a little ID card that said the word dependent on it. And they were that military dependent, and they went to a military school, and, all of their friends spoke in acronyms like, we're going to PCS and TDY and all of those things that were happening in their family. Well, now they're part of a different community. And it's so important that we recognize that transition and how important it is, and that we give them the appropriate identity now as the family of a fallen hero. So you're exactly right, that what TAPS can do is become that military community in such a powerful, appropriate, supportive way for all those who are grieving a loss and honoring a loved one.
Yeah. Just along those lines and thinking about the military today, have you seen any movement or changes? I know certainly TAPS being connected within branches and referrals that happen and being able to connect with families. Are there some changes you've seen though, and just even awareness or from among the different branches or ranks within the branches?
One of the most wonderful programs that we have that I'm so proud of, and I know you're connected to, is our military mentor program. So over the years, we've now had nearly 20,000 service members who have been trained by us to just be present to a grieving child, military child. At first, Andy, we thought that, these battle buddies, they're grieving loss as well. So we should have a grief group for the military. Well, nobody came. But as soon as we said, would you volunteer to support a child? Oh my goodness. Then we had a line out the door. But what we found were people were coming from the military with broken hearts. Yeah. They were coming grieving the loss of their buddies, grieving their own loss in their families and in their lives. And what they gained from these children were actually just someone who would wrap their arms right around them and say, I need you. And I want to have an authentic, raw conversation about people that we love.
It's a wonderful program. And as you said, it really is it's a family for those individuals, and to use, for lack of a better word to use, and it's therapeutic for them as well because of what they get from that and the connections they get. So it's certainly wonderful, and I'm certainly honored to be a part of that program and play a very small role in supporting and being part of the TAPS mission as far as that goes. So, we only have a few minutes left. Oh, I'm sorry. I spoke right over top of you.
No, I just said, Andy, we're so grateful and honored to have you on the team.
Well, thank you. And Bonnie, we only have a few minutes left, but quite often our listeners want to know, how can I connect with that wonderful program? How can I connect with that awesome person? Can you, how would that be if someone's listening and they want to connect with TAPS and with the work that you're doing, Bonnie? How would they do that?
Well, we'd love it. TAPS.org is our website, and @TAPS.org is our social media. We've got a volunteer central and so many ways for folks to connect. We've even got a wonderful page now for all those that are touched by COVID in this environment we're in. That's TAPS.org/COVID. So much that we can offer, resources to those who are grieving. And for those who would like to get involved, we'd love to have you.
Well, Bonnie, we want to thank you again for being our guest here at Let's Talk Death and for sharing your personal story and the great work you're doing with TAPS.
Well, thank you so much. It's been an honor.
Great. And again, thank you, Bonnie, and thank you for those who are joining us for this episode of Let's Talk Death. If you would like to learn more about Heal Grief, please visit us at healgrief.org. At healgrief.org, you can learn more about all of the programs and resources of Heal Grief, including our national network of support for grieving young adults. It's a program called Actively Moving Forward.
Let's Talk Death episodes will air monthly, so make sure you sign up on healgrief.org to receive your newsletter for a link to next month's episode on Let's Talk Death.
And again, thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time on Let's Talk Death.